Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to our inaugural Digital DNA webinar in association with Tughans. My name is Simon Bailey. I'm the CEO of Digital DNA, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's webinar, which will focus on changes to legislation that primarily impact your cash flow, not just in the current climate, but as we begin to emerge from lockdown and transition back to something resembling normality. Digital DNA is very much based on bringing together the tech community in Northern Ireland, and during these extraordinary times, we're finding new ways to do this whilst we have to put our in-person events on hold. I must therefore thank our long-term partner Tughans for their support in helping us deliver today's webinar. The format for today's session will begin with an introduction from John McGuckin, corporate partner at Tughans. John will provide us with some high-level thoughts on what key trends and topics Tughans are dealing with in the current climate. This will be followed by an overview from Andrew Kirk, the Contracts and Technology Director at Tughans. Andrew will provide an update on where we currently are in terms of financial support already available, much of which has been vital to help many companies through the current disruption. Andrew will also discuss key legal considerations for businesses in relation to contracts, employment options, access to finance and property. Finally, we'll wrap things up with a Q&A from John and Andrew, and I'm delighted they will also be joined by Jamie Watts from Amplify Solutions. Throughout today's webinar, you will be able to ask questions by using the chat bar to the right or by submitting a question in the Ask a Question tab just below where I am right now. So please feel free to use that, and we will endeavour to answer as many of those questions at the end. So before I hand over to John to get us started, I just wanted to finish off with some other housekeeping. As I've mentioned, please do feel free to use the chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen to engage with fellow guests or comment on today's webinar. But if you are going to put something in the chat box, please do remember to say something nice and be kind to your fellow guests. If someone does ask a question that you do want to ask as well, feel free to upvote it, and any questions that are popular, we will of course prioritize in our Q&A. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded, so you will have a chance to watch this back on demand should you encounter any connection issues as the session progresses. Okay, so let's get started. First up, I would like to welcome John McGuckin, corporate partner at Tughans. To many of you, John is well known within the local tech community and has extensive experience in the corporate legal sector, particularly in the areas of mergers and acquisitions, private equity and venture capital investments, general company law, and shareholder and governance matters. He also recently won Dealmaker of the Year at Insider Media Dealmaker Awards. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Simon. And thanks very much for having us here today. We value our relationship with Digital DNA and have been involved almost from creation, helping you across various different aspects of this, involving startups, larger entities, both Indigenous companies and inward investors. So we're delighted to be here today. As regards, Andrew's going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the support mechanisms out there and try and demystify and also give some on-hand experience. As regards the trends that we've seen from a legal perspective, I think the initial flurry was our employment team was extremely busy, just getting their heads around the furlough scheme, which Andrew will touch on, and also dealing with other queries as regards making people move and work from home. We've all largely got used to that now across the board. A lot of the client base here, the people listening in and the people that are part of your network will have been used to this for some time, but others haven't been, so it's getting up to speed on that. More generally, at a high level, given the nature of my work as a corporate solicitor, it's quite transactional, and I'm pleasantly surprised to be saying that there is still activity going on. In the mergers and acquisitions and purchaser sales, there are not a significant amount of those, certainly no new ones. Some have completed, thankfully, through this. But in the tech and in the investment space, we've completed a number of transactions over the last probably 5 to 6 weeks as people got used to things, things bedded down. So that community still exists. I'm aware, I'm currently waiting an email on another one that's meant to complete at the moment. So that space is still relatively vibrant. So I suppose one element I would say that this is detrimental to most businesses, but it shouldn't be an excuse for not progressing. As regards general trends outside of tech and the investment community continuing, we have seen a number of clients and a number of other high-profile businesses in Northern Ireland and further afield pivot very successfully into the world of PPE, which everyone is familiar with now, very successfully and across the board, across making scrubs, face shields, hand sanitizers. We've seen others see this as an opportunity in the specific issues that are happening. So returning to work, we've a client who has been inundated with requests in and around signage. So out of this, and we can touch on it later, there are opportunities. So I won't delay further. Thank you very much for having us on. I'll pass over to Andrew, who will touch on some of the schemes.
You're on mute, Glenn.
Thanks very much, John. Okay, so next up we have Andrew Kirk. Andrew works with clients across a full range of commercial contract matters with a particular focus on energy and technology law. He regularly advises clients on general commercial contracts such as supply or purchase, agency or distribution agreements, and technology contracts such as software licenses. Andrew's going to go through a bit of a presentation here now, so I will hand over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Simon. So pleasure to join everyone on the webinar today, and just to echo what John said in terms of thanking Digital DNA for the partnership and for the opportunity today. So I guess today is going to be a very quick run through of some of the support that's out there. I mean, some of this will be very familiar to most people by now, and some of the support schemes are already well bedded in. So I'm not proposing to go into any detail, just to maybe touch upon one or two more recent developments and flag up what's out there in terms of support for people if businesses aren't already aware. So I suppose just moving on to the first slide, Simon, looking at UK-wide support. So there are obviously a number of different measures available for businesses. So some of the ones that we've seen people availing of primarily include the CBIL scheme. So it's providing lenders with a government-backed guarantee of up to 80% against the outstanding facility balance, and also covers the first 12 months interest payments. Banks will look at security for these loans, but they aren't permitted to seek personal guarantees for sub to 250k loans. Moving on to the BBLS, the bounce back loan scheme. This one has been particularly relevant in a startup context. I understand most, if not all, of the local banks are now accredited for the bounce back loans, to offer bounce back loans. I mean, effectively, these are sort of a micro version of the CBIL scheme designed to allow SMEs to borrow between 2,000 and up to 25% of their turnover, up to a maximum of 50k. The process for applying for these has been slightly easier because the government guarantees 100% of the loan, which has made the application process easier for businesses. And again, there are no fees or interest to pay for the first 12 months. After the first 12 months, the interest rate is set at 2.5% a year, which is quite attractive. Finally, then, just I guess, particularly in a startup context, which will be relevant to a lot of people on the webinar today, there's the Future Fund. So the Future Fund is designed to provide government loans to UK-based companies ranging between 125k to 5 million, subject to at least equal match funding from private investors. And these loans are issued in the form of convertible loan notes, which convert to equity if they're not repaid. I suppose in a Northern Irish context, given that quite a few of the local funds offer support, which ultimately comes from state sources, there's a bit of a question mark at the minute over whether that will be qualifying investment. But that's something that businesses should be keeping under consideration. And if you're receiving that type of support, the fund manager may already have, or your liaison point of contact should already been in contact with you, or potentially been in contact with you about that. So just moving on then to the next slide, in terms of NI specific support, there have been a couple of measures that the NI executive have specifically rolled out to support local businesses here, which have been helpful. up to now, these have been primarily based around property and property values. For example, to avail of the hospitality and tourism grant scheme that's mentioned there, you must be operating in a physical premises in one of the relevant sectors. And the small business loan scheme is similarly based upon net asset value. But one of the things that has been helpful in a recent development has been the introduction of the micro business hardship fund. We're still waiting on complete details of the scheme, but it's been helpful that it doesn't specifically require property ownership. The key eligibility criteria requirement to employ between one, and that excludes an owner of the business or company director, and 9 employees who need to be paid via PAYE. You must have also experienced a reduction in your turnover in excess of 40%. We're still waiting on final details of the scheme coming out, which should be available next week alongside an application form that you can fill out on the relevant government websites. But there are additional eligibility criteria online, as well as a list of what you'll need to pull together if you're wanting to apply for that. So even if you check out the NI Business Info website, there's some pretty helpful information on there that outlines what you're required to pull together. So just moving on to the next slide then, in terms of some tax measures that are available, we don't provide tax advice to students. It's just a very quick signpost to what's out there. But if you haven't already, you should be looking at what options are available to you in terms of deferring your tax payments. And I suppose even if you're in a strong position financially, that's something that businesses looking to preserve the cash flow in the current context should be thinking about. So that includes things like VAT and self-assessment payment deferrals. And HMRC are also offering time to pay arrangements. I also understand that it's been announced in the past couple of days that some of the rates measures that we've seen may be rolled on for businesses in affected sectors for at least another month. So just moving on quickly then to the next slide, in terms of employee options. So obviously this is going to be a very key consideration for many businesses in the tech sector, given that employee costs are going to be one of, if not the main overhead, particularly if you've managed, say, businesses working in a co-working space who've been able to negotiate a deferral of any payments. And obviously, most people in the sector are now going to be aware of the basic elements of the job retention scheme or how to put employees on furlough, and will probably have, if your business has been impacted, a number of employees on furlough already. In terms of the recent developments around that, so our understanding is that it will be continuing as it is until the end of July, but will likely be tapered down then until the scheme ultimately closes at the end of October. The government is to announce details of exactly how that tapering down process is going to be affected and how that's going to be done. But it will likely involve employees resuming work on a part-time basis and employers starting to take more of the burden of meeting those employee salaries up to 100% then at the time that the scheme ultimately ends in October. So I guess one of the key takeaways for us in terms of today for businesses who have looked to furlough employees is around starting to think now about what your options are if you don't see a sales pipeline coming through that will permit you to recommence paying employee salaries for furloughed staff. So obviously that will vary depending on your business, what your sales pipeline looks like and what your lead time is into sales. But if you don't see that there will be the work there for employees that would allow you to continue or recommence paying employees at levels at the agreed salary levels, then you should be looking at your options. So one option here is in terms of agreeing alternative or reduced remuneration with employees. Obviously, that's an agreement that you need to reach with employees on a case-by-case basis. But in the tech sector in particular, it's fairly common for employees to be remunerated through cash and equity. And some of your employees, particularly if they've been with the company for a while, valued employees might be willing to share a bit of the pain if the cash flow is tight in return for some kind of equity options. So there's obviously different ways that you can achieve this. But from an employer perspective, the one that we would see most typically would be an option scheme where you're giving employees triggers to realize their equity options. And that's something that we've seen with a couple of local companies recently. So maybe that's a slight reduction in salary to help shoulder the burden of the next few months with a view to equity options in the longer term that will help them realize a larger part of the business. And ultimately, I suppose, and it's a difficult conversation to have, is just around having those conversations or thinking at least about redundancy. So, if you don't see that there's going to be work there for employees when they do return to work or when the furlough scheme ends, you need to be thinking about your obligations around a potential redundancy process. So there are consultation requirements and also an advance notice period required for that, typically between 2 and 4 weeks, depending upon the number of employees that you would be considering making redundant. So it's just, I guess, the signpost that you'd be wanting to think about that if your business is in that position. So just to move on to the next slide then, in terms of your contracts and payment plans and profiles, cash coming in, cash going out to both customers and suppliers. I guess from the customer side, it's important to think about what your options are in terms of leveraging payment. If customers are being unreasonable around payment terms, charging or at least threatening to charge interest might incentivize payment, especially where an interest rate is going to be higher than an interest on an overdraft facility, which you can get on fairly favorable terms at the minute. Even if you're operating on an oral or verbal contract, or your contract doesn't have an express interest provision, you can still charge statutory interest, which is set at 8% plus base at the minute. So, you'd be required to go to court to enforce that, but that's something that could be thrown out there if you're not able to have a sensible and reasonable discussion or negotiation with your customers. We've seen a lot of businesses also looking to restructure their contracts to try and front load customer payment as much as possible. I mean, obviously that's always the aim for businesses, to try and get as much cash up front as possible. But we've seen a lot of clients offering incentives ranging from, vouchers for discounted work, discounts on current bills, other kind of guarantees of future work to try and encourage a partnership approach with their customers. And particularly where customers are in a stronger financial position, cash flow wise, they may be willing to take advantage of those discounts to help some of their partners out. And in services-based contracts in particular, depending on the model that you have for selling your services, it might be better to have your staff undertaking some work at a discounted rate rather than no work at all. The government's also issued guidance note to public bodies. So if your business is supplying into the public sector, public bodies have been encouraged to assist at-risk suppliers. So if you're impacted, you might be wanting to have those conversations with any public bodies that you're working with to see what they can do for you in terms of advanced payment or accelerated payment in public contracts, or even giving you some leeway on KPIs that you might be needing to hit. And ultimately, I suppose, if you're not getting paid, I think there's been a bit of a misapprehension among some people that, court proceedings at the moment are entirely futile because of the situation, and courts not hearing routine cases, but courts still are accepting new proceedings for disputed debts, and you can still issue stat demands where there's an undisputed debt. So whilst hearings will be postponed, there's normally a bit of a lag time between starting out with that process and instructing a lawyer and then trying to get your cash back or having a hearing. And the vast majority of cases that we would work on would settle before things ever reach that stage. So if you have significant debts, your customer isn't paying up, that's something to consider. Just pivoting then to the supply side, it's worth saying that you want to be negotiating with suppliers to help keep your cash flow at a manageable level. Adopting a partnership approach can obviously help you foster stronger business relationships, and those should ideally continue beyond this situation. So with the shoe on the other foot, you might be wanting to try and agree deferred payment plans or pipelines for future work with your suppliers, and also looking to lower any variable costs, delay any discretionary expenditure that your business might have, and also explore options for financing your supply chain. So just moving on, one final point in terms of your customer contracts. So obviously in the current situation, you'd be looking to identify any unprofitable or unnecessary contracts, as well as any contracts that you might be no longer able to deliver on in light of any supply chain issues or force majeure circumstances that you might be facing. So that might be something that you want to look at. Also, just quickly considering whether you've got any insurance policies in place that might allow you to recover for business interruption loss. And just final slide then before we move on to the Q&A in terms of looking at your leases. So I suppose particularly for businesses in the tech sector, working from home has become the new normal, and I think it surprised a lot of our clients how effective that has actually been. I saw in the news recently that Twitter have told their employees that they can continue to work from home indefinitely if they want to. So some businesses have been looking at options to terminate their leases or move away from that traditional office-based model where they can do so and where they feel comfortable doing so. It won't obviously be a circumstance that allow you to terminate any leases that you have at the minute, in terms of the fact that your business has been impacted and there are COVID-19 restrictions in place. But you might be looking at options in terms of renewal, and even if you're in a position where you still want to keep an office space, negotiations with your landlord to reflect the fact that you're not currently making use of the premises, and in a situation where the commercial property market's probably going to be pretty challenging for the next while. So that's me in terms of a quick overview. Conscious not to take up too much time. There's a link at the bottom of the screen that you'll see to a legal hub that we've pulled together with some advice and guidance on some of these issues. Our details are in the slide there. If you want to reach out, please feel free to do so. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to field any questions now that anyone has. So I'll hand back over to Simon.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was very informative. And yes, anybody who is looking some more information on the details that Andrew's gone through and a lot of other details around sort of legal implications for the future, Tughans have put together a really cool website or a page, and the link is actually just below it here at the moment. And also during that presentation, we put a poll up. So we were asking, do you feel the support measures for businesses are adequate and that you properly understand what support is out there? I think overwhelmingly everybody who's answered that so far has said yes. And I think a lot of the initiatives that have been taken so far are to be welcomed. And I do hear a lot of people have been taking advantage of those. So hopefully that will help mitigate any of the problems that we could be facing over the coming weeks and months ahead. Okay, so we're now going to kick off our Q&A. I'm going to welcome John back on screen, and I'm also going to invite Jamie Watts from Amplify Solutions. Jamie is a specialist R&D tax credit provider, and he works with SMEs. He's worked with SMEs throughout his career. He's had roles in both commercial finance and resourcing before moving to Amplify last summer. His particular focus is on scale-up businesses, and he's built a strong understanding of the requirements for management teams within the space. Jamie, absolutely delighted that you can join us today. Okay, so again, we're hopefully we're on time here at the moment. We do hope to wrap up in sort of 15 minutes time, but we've had a few questions come through already. Actually, I've had a few ping through to me there privately. Everyone seems to be quite shy at the moment, so I'll get cracking with some of these at the moment. And we'll start with a question for all of you, perhaps. Recently, we surveyed over 100 companies in the local tech community back when the coronavirus crisis was really starting to bite. And pretty much everybody agreed without any surprise that a global recession was inevitable. And we're already beginning to see that bite with the latest unemployment figures and economic predictions for the rest of the year. But with any economic downturn, there's always some winners. Do any of you think there are businesses out there who will actually win from this situation, or perhaps there are new trends emerging that we should be considering? I suppose I'll probably ask Jamie to kick us off on that one, as we haven't heard from him yet.
Yeah, no problem at all. We can all hear me okay. Yes, it's probably one that we thought would probably come up today in terms of talking about an inevitable recession. Now, in looking back, I suppose at the last, look at the last 100 years of recessions that have gone on and off. There's been multiple companies that have done very well or started up during recessions. Like your HPs, FedEx, Electronic Arts, companies like that. So there's some big names that start up during recessions. In terms of who can we see winning, well, there's certain sort of industries I suppose that do quite well. And I know we're talking to a largely digital audience just now, but if you think of your customer base or potential customer base, we're talking about pivoting. Things like utilities are going to do incredibly well. People still need their heat, their light, their power. People's vices, so alcohol, fast foods, these sort of things. I think we all probably cracked open the wine too early in the day recently as well, so we're all aware that people tend to go into their devices a bit more during these times. And I hate to use this expression, but cheap products, but I suppose products that drive value, so your that sort of thing, they typically do really well at this time. So it's about understanding your customer base, how your business is set up, and how you can maybe start, I suppose, pointing in that direction to the sectors that will do particularly well during this, where people will want to spend their money, and working at how you can, again, use that word again, but pivot towards them.
John, what about you? I know you're obviously quite close to some of our startups in the region. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so we're seeing a good trend, as I mentioned, as regards companies being investable. We're seeing some where they are slightly diversifying, but using their core products in this market. You know, we obviously have Axial 3D in the 3D printing space. We have others going into the PPE market. There is a definite trend. I know from where I sit, it's basically a revolving door for Amazon arriving to my house, which is quite painful to watch. But that type of business, e-commerce, we're seeing a lot of businesses. We've had a number ask us about, you know, e-commerce terms or otherwise. So being able to get your product or otherwise to the market. So there's less tangible, less digital ones we've seen in and around. You know, there's obviously, as Jamie mentioned, in and around the food market. But in the IT space, there are a number of different projects going on. So if you're supplying into the health service, for example, which a number of our larger IT consultancy practices do, that will not diminish. You know, there is an increased need for it. There are other sectors less relevant here, and again, using the word pivot, you know, in the manufacturing space, some have not necessarily thrived, but survived by taking a different route. Similarly, in the food and distribution space, you know, supermarkets, it's flying. So we have a couple of clients who are now actively in acquisition mode because they would like to acquire different brands or otherwise. So out of this, there are different, you know, to be certain winners.
So, you know, obviously, as we're facing into a recession, you know, is this a good time for people out there to perhaps think about launching a new service within their business, or even actually, you know, spinning up a brand new business? Is this the right time to be thinking about that, Andrew?
Yeah, I suppose it depends upon the product or service that they're launching. I think there are certain types of products and services that taking advantage of a gap in the market, or, you know, some opportunity given the shift in how people live and work and, you know, consume products and services. So, you know, we've seen like one of our clients that offers home gym equipment, for example. They would have had a B2B play. You know, they would have been selling into larger scale gyms, and that would have been how they made their money. But at the minute, with people ordering home gym equipment, you know, they've never been busier, but they've had to rapidly shift how they do their business to adapt to that. I mean, obviously businesses will have a bit more, businesses who are, you know, maybe quieter, who have been impacted by what's going on, will have a bit more bandwidth to be considering launching new products and services. So in the sense of maybe innovating, thinking about what you're going to do, how you're going to differentiate yourself from your competitors whenever you come back, it's probably a great time to do that. And I think, you know, even in traditional sectors that have been like food and leisure that have been really badly impacted by this, the businesses that do well are going to be the ones who launch new products and services, who think about a new route to market that maybe their competitors aren't. So yeah, but I suppose, you know, if your new product or service requires upon, you know, or is based upon in-person, you know, supply, or these restrictions being lifted, maybe it's a time to hold off to line it up now and launch once the restrictions are lifted. I guess it just varies, doesn't it?
Yeah, and probably just it's a nice sort of segue into a question that Roger has just posted there. It's probably one for Jamie. How do you see the R&D world evolving or adapting to a post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Interesting one. I think, again, I just because history repeats itself so often, if you just look back at some of the businesses that probably invested heavily in R&D during other downturns have done very well on the back of it. It's about finding a good balance, I suppose. So take another example. A business that didn't do it was Sony. They decided to scale back all their R&D processes during the last recession, and they got overtaken quite quickly by a number of providers. So I suppose it's a good time to be spending lots of money. Well, your accountant will tell you definitely not. But is it a good time to be sitting a team down on video calls right now and saying, guys, spend an hour a day thinking about new opportunities, what you can be doing? So yeah, I think it's actually a fantastic time to be thinking about your R&D, your innovation as a company just now. And because when the world changes, it's going to be an opportunity for somebody to do very well in a number of organizations. So right now, R&D claims are a great way to drive a bit more cash into the business. Most people, again, on this call who are digital companies are probably spending money on development of some sort anyway. So it's an opportunity to use that and turn it into cash. I think we're talking about cash flow being king just now. It's a sensible thing to do. Anyone, it's a bit of a win-win. I think there'll be, if you look at the number of online portals that are opening up in this space as well, it's becoming a much more regular conversation, alongside who's doing your accounting, who's doing your legal work, for you as well. Are you doing these, are you taking steps to make sure your R&D is being recorded well, and and how you're going to transform the company with that. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really good time for R&D companies, and the government looks like it's going to be promoting the scheme pretty heavily going forward. They forget the Brexit stuff, but they obviously see this as an opportunity for the UK to drive additional income from new markets as well.
That's great, Jamie. Thank you. There's another question there, and I think it will actually, I'm going to add a bit to it as well for everybody. So it's from Richard. Do you think the government financial support schemes for Northern Irish startups have been adequate? And I suppose that links into what everyone's views are on the future fund terms and how likely they are to benefit startups in a local context.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that one. It's a tough world, the funding landscape for startup companies in any event. I think from more generally, we are relatively well served in that we have Invest Northern Ireland sponsored tech funds start and otherwise, and development funds supported just above that. In general, obviously they were in play pre-COVID. The nature of startup funding is a difficult beast. In general, most that we work with, albeit there are a serious number of success stories and don't have to operate in this, but there is a number of hand to mouth, and that is an ongoing basis that most of the parties listening to this call and in the startup world are working in. So it's tough. Has there been any flagship in advance of the future fund that really stand out for startups? No. I think that's across the board, unfortunately. That's the nature of the funding is, and in that startup world, in an ideal world, is that you don't have all that many overheads. It is lean. You haven't entered into a long lease. You've got a tight employment base. So it is tough to have seen what other mechanisms, like we've racked our brains in the sense that we have a good relationship with the British Business Bank enough to be able to tell them as regards to what else could be there. If it's appropriate, unless anyone has any other comments, on the future fund, it is a welcome addition. It's as regards hot off the press, it was released last night in more terms. There were, when it was initially released a couple of weeks ago, about the principle of it and certain ideas. There was a lot of criticism. There were a lot of holes being found in it. But there is sufficient more detail now that people should ideally know to be able to progress with it from here. It's pretty formulaic money in the convertible loan note sense. There are probably a few things you can play around negotiation wise, but it's there. But it does, it does rely on the fact that you have to have other sources of funding, which, and this is easy for me to say, I just document, is always incumbent on the startups here and otherwise sourcing. So it doesn't change the landscape. It gives you the opportunity. It's going to be open for a number of months. It gives you the opportunity to source that matched funding. and go out and attain it. And it is there. Like, I'm very firmly believe that this will be oversubscribed, whether in the wider UK and with the Northern Irish hat on, we're allowed to a number of companies already looking at this, lining it up, getting ready to push the button tomorrow.
Very good. I'm just going to jump into, there's a couple of other questions here, possibly here for Andrew. Do you see the job retention scheme reducing from 80% to encourage employees to return to work?
Yeah, I think that's the understanding now that's sort of widely shared in the industry, is that it's probably going to be tapered down to zero at the end of October. So, final details are to come out, and we don't know this for certain, but it looks at the minute like it may be reducing down month by month. With employers taking more of the burden of paying those salaries until it tapers down to zero, and with the potential for employees to return back to work on a part-time basis then as well, because obviously it's not sustainable in the long term.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Has anyone anything to add on that, or I suppose Andrew's our expert on that piece?
I would say that.
Very good. Another one here for Jamie. Will HMRC Fast Track RD claims to allow for faster payments? Sorry, Jamie. Yeah. Sorry, Jamie.
Yeah, no problems. They already have done, which is really positive news. So they have for smaller, medium companies, they have a 28-day turnaround from submitting cash in bank as a SLA. They've been meeting that, and in most cases recently exceeding that. So it's really positive. I think, without saying open the floodgates in front of two lawyers, they certainly have exceeded expectations and seem to be realizing that this is an opportunity for people to bring cash into companies, particularly smaller companies, so they don't want to stymie it by putting any roadblocks in the way. So we've been really happy with clients and getting cash much more quickly than assumed. I would think this is them on the way to the process to make it even slicker than it is just now. So hopefully that can only be a good thing. And they're always going to start at the smaller company end, because that's where the cash is obviously most required.
Excellent, Jamie. Thank you. I've had another one sent to me here anonymously. I think actually it's for Andrew, and I think it might have been answered, but you might want to add something. Early on in the crisis, everyone was preserving cash in order to survive, and inevitably that has led to payment terms being extended, or in some cases ignored altogether. What is your view on businesses commencing any court proceedings against debtors? Would you recommend it, or is the preferred method to engage for longer payment terms?
I think it's something you have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. I mean, some of your customers may be in a situation where they genuinely, don't have the money to pay their debts, and there are ways of looking at that in terms of credit checks, and you can get a feel for that yourself, I suppose, depending on the specific customer that you're dealing with and how honest they've been with you in the past, how long you've dealt with them for. I mean, we wouldn't be encouraging people to rush to suing their clients or their customers if they're a day or two overdue on payment, obviously. But I suppose ultimately, you can only engage with somebody for so long until you get to a point where there's a pragmatic realization that this person has no intention of paying me, or I'm going to the absolute bottom of the list in terms of their payment plans. And by being more reasonable and continuing to engage with somebody, you're just sort of being strung along. So I think if you've come to a point where you feel that that's the case, then you should be looking at your options in terms of commencing court proceedings. As I think I mentioned in the talk, that there's obviously a lead time into that, and you need to send pre-action letters. You need to have instructed solicitors. The vast majority of cases that we will be involved in, or disputes we'll be involved in, will settle before they do get to court. And as I said in the talk as well, courts are still accepting stat demands. They're still accepting the papers for disputed claims. That's something that you can go ahead with. Obviously, the proceedings will be delayed for a period of time, but I think the Courts Tribunal Service are looking at alternative ways to hear those kinds of cases. And as lockdown measures start to ease, we'd expect things to return to normal. So, it is something I think business should be looking at if they're in that situation.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. There's another question here from Gary, who many of you will know, and it's directed at Jamie. But I might actually expand it out. Have you noticed any increases in fraud around R&D tax credits during COVID? And I suppose to perhaps just expand onto that, with a lot of the initiatives that have been put in place, what's people's views, or what are your thoughts on people potentially gaming the system and the implications to that, perhaps in 3 to 6 months' time? John, do you want to kick us off on that one?
I suppose the most potentially relevant one for us is the furlough JRS, in the sense that you're alive to, through social media or otherwise, parties who have employees who become aware that they are furloughed, but they're working away. I suppose in the nature of the world that we're in, the digital world, it is less likely that will happen now, because an employee will very firmly call that out, or a lot of employees will. It is possible. It's also the nature of, what can you actually, like, we struggle with this as well. What can you actually get a furloughed employee to do in and around? Is it research or less tangible pieces? So I don't necessarily, and I certainly haven't been party to any parties actively flaunting the system. It will, as it starts to taper down, become more relevant, because people will very firmly want to avail of what is an extremely good support scheme, and continue to avail of that for as long as possible.
Jamie, what about from an R&D perspective? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hope not. Well, it's one issue. It's one of these things that part of our processes was that we have to hold on to liability for claims. So if HMRC were to investigate, then it'd be ourselves who have to be part of that investigation. So the reason we have people who are software engineering backgrounds in our team is to try and make sure we're not missing out on that sort of fraudulent activity, and making sure everything's justified. However, like all frauds, you can only, a lot of time, you can only really go on what people are telling you. So I'd really hope that's not the case, and I'm sure some people may try to override not just our scheme, but the government schemes. I mean, my just example, my wife's self-employed, and she had a grant just in there for lost revenues in the last couple months come in there, and you get a portal telling you, is all this true, and you have to think back to yourself, making sure that you're not lying to HMRC somehow along your. So I don't think we did. So I think the point is, we'll see it. Hopefully nothing at a large scale, but like John says, I think the furlough scheme is the one that we'll pay close attention to, because that's the one's by far most open to fraudulent activity, unfortunately.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on that?
I don't really have much to add on top of what the guys have said already, particularly around the R&D tax credits. Definitely defer to Jamie on that one. But I mean, you'll obviously see an increase in fraud. I suppose we have seen it already, both in a business context and in even in a personal context, like in terms of fraudsters go where the money is, and if they see that there are opportunities to take advantage of schemes or of businesses in the current climate, they'll try and do that. But you'd like to hope that there are measures in place to cover that. And certainly the NI executive support schemes are pretty crystal clear in terms of their eligibility criteria. So I think the furlough one's probably the one where there's most scope for abuse. Yeah,
and hopefully we'll begin to see some clarity coming out around what's possible towards the end of this week. I think that's when there's an expectation there will be some announcement around what the roadmap looks like as we move through the summer months. Gents, I think that's we're pretty much on time there. There's probably just one last thing I want to ask all of you, and it's probably something for all of our guests to take away. What would be your number one tip to help businesses navigate the months ahead? We'll start with Andrew, as you're right beside me on the screen.
I think my takeaway would just be cash is king. That was the whole focus of the presentation today. Particularly if you're not seeing a really significant sales pipeline, just be really proactive in terms of how you're managing your cash flow and helping protect and shield your business over the next 6 to 12 months until things start to normalize again.
John?
I suppose wouldn't necessarily differentiate from what I would say generally would be communication, as in communicate with everyone possible. Communication in some senses is harder. You're not able to give a handshake. You're not able to engage with someone from an investor to investee company perspective. You can't get a feel for someone. You can't go for 5 pints and test the merits of someone. But more generally, it's actually easier. You can engage, you can speak to people. I would be advising companies that as regards securing your business through the communication with your banks and various other parties is key. Communicate with others. You know, we are touch wood coming out of this slowly but surely. This is now the time to ramp up. If you need investment, if you're not, if you qualify or otherwise for the future fund, that doesn't mean that you can't get investment. So I would be communicate, get out there as much as you can.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of companies that I'm speaking to at the moment. That's what they're doing. They're taking this sort of time to assess, you know, root and branch, what their business means, how they, you know, probably getting around to doing a lot of the things that they wanted to do and just didn't have time. Jamie, what about yourself? What piece of advice would you give companies for the next couple of months?
Yeah, just a couple of really quick ones would be sort of based on what you guys have said. Just know your numbers. It's a great time to look at. If you can't do it yourself internally, find something to help you look at your processes and your numbers over the next probably 6 to 9 months, even a year, and work out, you know, what sort of runway you have there to follow through on what you'd had planned. And then just alongside that, talking to a lot of the private equities and VCs just now, they're looking for companies who can save companies money right now, maybe rather than what was before where you could add value and sort of bottom line to companies. People are looking at cost savings potentially now. So that's the same to think about. What can your product or service do to save companies money? And maybe sign in good stead for the next period of time.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. And I think we get through a lot of the questions that came in. So once again, a massive thank you to our guests, Jamie, John and Andrew. And once again, a special thank you to Tughans for helping support this session. We do hope to be running more of these webinars in the coming weeks and months. So stay tuned for that. And if we didn't answer any of the questions that came through privately, we will try and get back to you in the coming days. That's all for now, folks. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks.